Hello, good afternoon and good morning, wherever you are in the country and around the world. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us for our weekly webinar series. Today, we're going to focus on one of really the hottest marketplaces that we cover within our research, customer data platforms. The topic today is how to select the right customer data platform. It's going to be taken through the presentation by our CEO and founder, Tony Byrne. And my name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group. And as we get started, I do see a number of new folks on the line today, so welcome. And for those that have joined us in the past, thanks for taking some time to come back and join us again. It's great to have some repeat attendees as well. And if you do have questions at any point during the presentation today, we will have time at the end to get to those. So you can enter questions into the GoToWebinar control panel, or if you have any feedback on the slides, we certainly are always open to hearing feedback from our attendees as well. Also, you will be getting a copy of the slides from today's presentation within the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for an email from our marketing team with the slides. So just to dive in a little bit about Real Story Group, we are an analyst firm, and the reason why we say how to select the right CDP is because we don't believe in ranking the best or worst vendor, but rather we're all about helping you find the solution that's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. Now you'll see here on the map, these are our different coverage areas, and we've been following things like web content management for the last 20 years and digital asset management for the last 10 plus years. And in terms of the customer data platform marketplace, that's the orange line there. And that's something that we've been publishing research on for a couple of years now. And as the market continues to expand and there seems to be new vendors on a weekly basis, what we're trying to do is make sense of that marketplace so you can make sure that you're getting the solution that's going to accomplish your needs and really help you to manage that customer data. So I'm going to turn things over to Tony here, who's going to provide a little more background about Real Story Group and get into the presentation about how to select the right CDP. So Tony, take it away.
Great, thanks, Scott. As Scott mentioned, we're a different kind of analyst firm. I founded Real Story Group nearly 20 years ago. Because of this quadrant that you see on the left, of course, we're making fun of the Forrester Wave or the Gartner Magic Quadrant, this idea that there's definitively good and bad vendors in these marketplaces. And as Scott mentioned, what we're really trying to do is get you to the right fit. And so our mission in life is really to produce the toughest, most hardest hitting evaluations you can find. And to do that, we decided very early on that we had to be truly independent. So unlike really any other analyst firm in the world, we don't consult with vendors. We won't speak at vendor events. We don't accept a cup of coffee for them. We don't write white papers for them. They can't use us for their press releases. So we're totally on your side, that of the enterprise buyer. And we've been watching enterprises buy all kinds of technologies for the last 20 years. And so we put together a fairly methodical approach to this that we're going to share with you in the context of CDPs. And, you know, if there's any kind of silver lining out of this crisis, it's that we may become more methodical in our decision making and maybe take a step back and figure out what is it that we really need rather than what we think we need. And so hopefully the rest of this half hour together will be able to help you get to that place as well. But where we all need to start is really with the context, like why would you even want a CDP in the first place? What are you trying to accomplish? And I think we can all agree that we want sort of idealized customer engagement here, that we've got all of these different channels where we're contextualizing and assembling experiences. And within each engagement channel, we want to get the right content and message to the right person in the right context at the right time and then measure the effectiveness, right? And so many engagement channels, therefore, put these kind of services at your fingertips with respect to content, data, rules, planning, and analytics. The problem is when you're talking about 11 different engagement channels, this causes a problem for the customer, is that you end up with these isolated, disjointed, and inconsistent customer experiences across all of these, you know, with content and data really stuck within individual engagement silos. And I think we've all been really experiencing that as we've been modernizing our engagement silos over the last 10 years, is that these kind of horizontal integration patterns really aren't working very well in a world where every year we're adding new silos here of engagement. And so, the answer to this, we believe, is in foundation services, where you have omni-channel operations for cross-team collaboration and planning, and unified customer data, journey orchestration, omni-channel content, and of course a layer of customer intelligence underneath all of this. And you can see the services on the right. What does this actually deliver to me? And we're all trying to get here. We call this a target reference model because this is really more aspirational than real right now. Almost all of the large enterprises that we work with and advise are trying to get to some version of this. And very often the question we get is, what do I do first? And the reality is that these are all related, so you can't ignore any of these. But if there was one that you were going to prioritize as like the capo di capi here, it would be that orange segment, that you have to get your customer data house in order if you want to be able to do everything else in a more customer-centric way. And so this idea of having a single source of definitive customer data and segments of all these foundational services, that's truly foundational. And so, that's why really at your behest, we've been paying a lot of attention to customer data technology. And what this means fundamentally is that you can see in an orange box underneath, you have customer data platforms that live underneath all of these different content and engagement platforms. So the idea is that you have a unified place where all of your relevant customer can live, and then supply that data contextually to all these different content and engagement platforms, all the interaction delivery environments, ultimately feeding through these specific engagement channels or venues to your customers. So that, from an architectural point of view, that's where this all fits in. We'll come back to this a little bit later because this is germane with respect to how are you selecting a tool. Our argument here, and this is really kind of the first takeaway for you of many takeaways this afternoon, is you should think about your CDP needs in a more omni-channel context and not just in the context of MarTech, or, and for that matter, any individual channel. Now, very often, for very good reasons, MarTech is taking the lead on this. Many CDP vendors, in fact, market explicitly to MarTech leaders, and it makes sense because they have some of the more urgent needs. But if you really want to be successful, you want to think more long-term and more omni-channel. What are my needs across all of these different engagement channels? Because some CDP vendors are going to support some better than others. Right? So the first lesson here is you want to take a more holistic, more long-term approach. Second lesson is that you need to be very careful about other vendors who are not necessarily independent CDP vendors trying to tell you that they could be your CDP going forward. So we see this in the ad tech stack. We see this in certain CRM platforms where they say you can just use our CRM solution as your quote unquote marketing database or your customer database. Certainly see this a lot in email marketing and automation. Major WCM vendors like Sitecore and Episerver tell you that their personalization layers have a customer data platform underneath. But the problem with those is that they're all stuck in a particular channel. What you really want at a lower level is customer data that's independent of any channel, right? And so the other thing that you'll see sometimes is analytics platforms or even identity management platforms saying that they can be your CDP. Sometimes these are, and the former are built off a data lake, which does not necessarily make for a good CDP. And certainly some journey orchestration engines, because they really need access to this data, will bundle CDP services. And you really want to avoid that. Where you want to have ultimately, particularly if you're a larger enterprise, is to have your customer data disengaged or decoupled from these other platforms so you can truly provide independent data to all of these different engagement channels at the top. So this is kind of an architectural preview, and I wanted to remind you that at any time you can ask questions or make comments on things you agree with, your personal situation, or things you disagree with. Would love to hear from you. You can just type it into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those at the end of the session today. So what is a CDP? Many of you have seen charts like this. This is our particular take on it, that you have first-party customer data, which increasingly is your most important customer data. Some of our subscribers have as many as 1,000 points or more of first-party customer data. Second and third-party data, obviously under some stress these days for good reasons, but still potentially important. Whether you feed those directly into the CDP or use some intermediary layer to enrich that data is kind of an open architectural question. But the idea here is that you have this CDP services in the middle that give you ultimately the two big things they give you, the customer API and segmentation. Then on top of that, there's all kinds of other things that they may handle. But the goal here is then they can supply that data in those segments to all those different channels on the right. Localized analytics, or what some people call democratized analytics, or business-facing analytics, is an interesting one. We'll get to that in a second about whether you really want that in a CDP or not, but certainly some CDP vendors target that use case as well. So this is what they do, but what we would argue is more important when you're vetting these solutions is to look at specific business use cases. So Real Story Group has been using this methodology for nearly 2 decades now when we go out and evaluate CDP vendors. So when we evaluate CDP vendors, we use a lot of different dimensions to that, but one of the central things that we do is look at their capabilities with respect to these 10 potential CDP use cases. Now, as you would see in any marketplace, not all CDP vendors support all 10 of these use cases or even support them evenly. And so you'll typically see a CDP vendor, usually based on their early implementations, target 2 or 3 use cases really well, 2 or 3 use cases kind of, sort of, and then 3 or 4 they just historically have ignored. It doesn't mean they can't do them, but you might need to take a lot of time, money, and ibuprofen to get it to support those. So that's why it's really important for you to understand what are the ones that are most important to you. So for example, for some enterprises, particularly on the B2C side, digital advertising support might be really important. On the B2B side, you may need to have these notions of household or channel or company entities, which some CDPs, actually most CDPs, are not very good at modeling. So those are examples where, you know, those two at the bottom might almost be sort of opposing kind of use cases. One we've added more recently, particularly in light of some of the legal and regulatory things coming up, is around loyalty as well, just supporting loyalty management. Doesn't mean that the CDP itself is your loyalty manager, but that it supports those use cases. Similar for like outbound marketing campaign support, it doesn't mean that the CDP is actually generating email messages or text for you, but rather that's a use case that it supports very aggressively and often has connectors to systems like Marketo or Adobe Campaign or HubSpot or what have you. So a lot of different use cases. First thing you want to do is prioritize among them. You can kind of group these, though, into 3 clusters. So those that are primarily related to activation, those that are primarily related to data management in the lower left, and then those that are primarily related to data analytics in the lower right. And so the other way that we've grouped these vendors, or one way we've grouped these vendors is, you know, what is their overall emphasis? And so this is another way of thinking about vendors that may or may not target your use case. And what was interesting when we put this together is we found that there's almost a kind of perfect triangle here where there's no vendor in the middle that really is trying to do all 3 of these, and that's probably just as well. The one in the middle might be a master of none, right? And so I think it's a good thing that vendors are somewhat specializing here as well. And again, a friendly reminder, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll for sure get to those later. This logo landscape is maybe a little bit more meaningful. I think particularly if you're starting from scratch, which is that from just a sheer sort of vendor size and independence perspective, you can divide the market into these suite vendors that all now purport to sell CDPs. Acoustic is the former IBM portfolio. And then these pure play platforms, some of which have been around for a long time, some of which are newer. They've seen collectively more than $1 billion in venture funding over the last 3 to 5 years. So often flush with cash, often growing, but often also smaller companies, maybe ranging in size from 100 to 400 employees. So you have this sort of bifurcation in the marketplace this way as well, which you very often see in a young marketplace. So to that extent, CDPs here aren't really that much different than other marketplaces. So what's interesting is we've done a lot of research on the suite vendors, and we're in the process of updating the Adobe and Salesforce ones now because they're still kind of sort of in beta. Adobe claims it's not, but kind of feels that way. And so that gets our first themes that these are relative newcomers, and I think you'll find some surprising immaturity in some of these technologies, which might seem kind of against conventional wisdom since these are some of the most mature vendors that you'll see, but that doesn't mean their CDP platforms are very mature. The other thing is that their initial use cases, whatever verbiage they give it, their initial use cases are around unifying customers within their own stacks, right? So their first goal is to try to unify the customer data records within their own product lines, which have been incredibly disparate because of acquisitions over the years, rather than being a truly independent layer. The other thing you have to be very careful about with these vendors is that they often require you to license multiple pieces of their technology, either above or below their CDPs. That's why our advice to all of you is you should maybe explore these if you already are a licensee of some of their other solutions, but don't default to them as a CDP because it might end up being a poor fit for you. Pure play vendors remain viable. I think are going to continue to remain viable. I mean, many of them are specializing in particular verticals or niches or geographies that may make them maybe not good acquisition candidates in any sense. These are smaller vendors, and so sometimes the companies themselves and their ecosystems in particular aren't always as mature as you might like. They're also expanding sometimes into other technologies like journey orchestration or really pushing the envelope of what a CDP should do in a large stack and maybe providing more services than you might like, so that you want to have some cautions there. There's legitimate concerns about whether the market can support all of these. I think that it's important to understand that almost all of them are pretty richly funded right now. At least before this current crisis, there was a rising tide lifting several boats here. And so, I'm not telling you not to do your diligence on this. On the other hand, I don't expect this marketplace to collapse per se over the next couple of years. What's interesting about all of these vendors is that they tend to score, comparatively lower on what we call strategic considerations. So one of the things that Real Story Group makes available to our subscribers is this notion of a real quadrant, that you build a real quadrant rather than a magic quadrant. And what's real about it is it's dynamic based on your specific needs and use cases. And so you define your strategic considerations and that represents the y-axis, and then your scenarios you're trying to target is the x-axis. And so what's interesting is we did this and took a bucket of scenarios and just did, okay, here's how we might do some random weighting of strategic considerations. And we found this was kind of a generic quadrant that the vendors are kind of saggy, which is another way of saying that in terms of strategic considerations, which are things like ecosystems, product maturity, extent of an implementation channel, that sort of thing, these vendors kind of fail, or not fail, but are lower relative to other marketplaces. So that's something to just keep in mind as well. Not suggesting you not to implement these tools, but rather just to sort of keep that in mind. So how do you go out and select a CDP? Well, we've been helping customers select technology, marketing, and content technologies for the last 20 years or so. A couple of years ago, my colleague Jared and I encapsulated everything that we knew into a book called The Right Way to Select Technology from Rosenfeld Media. And our big mission really with this book was to apply design thinking to heretofore what was really kind of waterfall approaches to selecting technology. So by design thinking, we're saying, hey, put together an interdepartmental team, take a test-based approach. It's based on use cases, iterate and adapt because your requirements are never going to be perfect up front. So start with light requirements that are based on narrative use cases that involve real humans, and then go through an iterative test-based process, A, to test the vendors, but B, to test your own requirements, which are likely to evolve as you get smarter about this. So this is how it's represented as a triangle. You can see some other webinars we've done that delve into this in more detail. But first, if you apply design thinking, you know that you want to empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and then test. And so the empathy is the really key part here, which is to create diverse user stories. And some people have said, well, how do you do that with something like a CDP, which is really all about data? And I'm here to tell you that that data is A, managed by humans and designed to be, in your enterprise, and B, designed to put in service of other humans who are your customers. This is a very human process, and so you want to create user stories here. Now, granted, some users or actors could be other systems that you want to integrate with, like a data lake for sure, but you want to create these user stories. Then you want to define maybe 6 to 8 vendors who would create where you send an RFP and provide on your shortlist. This is where a lot of Real Story Group's research can help you. Review proposals and demos from maybe 4 of them. Again, they're demoing your user stories, not the vendors. And then this is the most important part, and I'm just absolutely dumbfounded that some enterprises skip this, which is to do a hands-on bake-off. And you can do a CDP bake-off. We've led some of our subscribers through this. You can actually test these systems to see, are you pushing with them or are you pushing against them? And then ultimately, you may want to test further with respect to security, performance, speed, particularly if you're doing real-time stuff, in some kind of an optional POC before you actually sign a contract. So the key lesson here is try before you buy. And one of the reasons you want to get hands-on is there's very different ways of doing these sorts of things. So here's a couple of different ways that you might build a campaign segment, very different ways of doing this in 2 different systems. And you'll see, by the way, across 30 different platforms that we evaluate, probably 30 different ways that or at least 25 out of 30, 25 different ways that a marketer or CX specialist would actually build a segment on top of all of this data. And so usability becomes a really important issue if that's one of your use cases that you're going to have marketing or other engagement people actually build declarative segments within this platform. How do they go about doing it? Do I need to be a developer? Do I need to be a data scientist? How easy is this? What if my segments are really complicated? What kind of rules can I apply here? So on and so forth. So it's one of the many, many, many things that you want to test, but you want to test in the context of your particular use cases. Okay, key takeaways, then we'll get to your questions. First, CDPs, whether you're packaging them or you're trying to build your own, and I'm not necessarily recommending you build your own, but either way, they're increasingly foundational to a truly omni-channel strategy, right? So you've got to be thinking about data marts, whether you build one yourself or you get a packaged CDP, as really the, as I said, the capo di capi, or the most foundational of your enterprise foundation. But don't build a CDP in another packaged platform. In other words, don't have your marketing automation platform, your CRM, your journey orchestration engine, your generic data lake. Don't have those serve as a CDP because they're not really custom built to do that. There are many different use cases. We've isolated kind of 10 meta use cases. You'll come up with your own specific variants against those, but you'll really want to prioritize and understand which ones are going to be more important, at least in the first several years. You've got a big, wide marketplace to confront. We're certainly adding more vendors each quarter as some of them grow up, and we believe it's likely to be fragmented for some time. So the bad news is you have a lot of choices, but the good news is you have a lot of choices. And I think based on our experience, you have a lot of opportunities to get really the right fit. Large vendors are finally starting to play in this space. I say finally because many of them sort of rejected the whole idea of this, but you need to understand that their solutions continue to lag the market. In terms of actually going through and selecting which one's the right one for you, we will always, always, always suggest an agile-oriented selection process that features adaptive testing first with respect to a proposal, a demo round, a bake-off, and possibly a POC after that. So then part of that process, definitely you want to try before you buy. And any CDP vendor who tells you, no, it's too complicated, it's too hard, too much security, whatever, that's a vendor you want to avoid because they're basically trying to sell you the car by driving it around the parking lot themselves and have you watch them as opposed to you actually driving it. I'd be remiss here if I didn't mention that certainly Real Story Group's research and advisory can help your team make the right decision. And so our mission in life is to help this person we call Stacy the Stacker. She's the stack owner. People come at her with all kinds of different questions. Her job is to put together a coherent technology stack, which is harder than ever. Our job is to try to shield Stacy from, some of those more difficult questions so she can think about, more pleasant sorts of things. So we're really, if you're Stacy, we are definitely your advocate throughout this whole process. 3 different ways you can work with us. One is what we call vendor selection advisory. So you subscribe to our CDP research. You get all the inside dirt on all of these vendors, what's good about them, but more importantly, what's bad about them. So you get access to the research and you get access to us. So we want to inform and empower your technology selection teams, not just with our research, but with candid advice. So you get email and phone access to us. Some of our larger subscribers just ask for the whole kit and caboodle. So we call this the Omni-Channel Stack Advisory, where they get access to all 150 different vendor evaluations, but we also advise them on stack decision-making. What are the strategic decisions and gaps and technology choices ahead of them? A subset of those have joined our Omni-Channel Council Stack Leadership group, and this has been really a fascinating executive, completely private, peer-level support. We just had our second meeting before this whole crisis. It was in February. You can go to our LinkedIn page and see some of the outcomes from those meetings if you're interested in that. This is obviously only for enterprise stack leaders and not for vendors. So with that, I'll let Scott talk about next steps, and I'll take a look at some of the questions that have come through. And again, if you have other questions, feel free to type them in. We'll definitely have time to take them over.
Great, thanks, Tony. And if you'd like to learn more about those different subscription options in terms of pricing and what will be available to you, you can reach out to us at explore@realstorygroup.com. With that, we can schedule some time to take you on a behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience. Really give you an overview of the tools that Tony mentioned for helping you narrow down to a custom shortlist and compare the vendors side by side. And then see which of the offerings that we have available makes the most sense for what it is that you're trying to do. You can also download excerpts from any of the research areas we cover. So if you'd like to take a look at a detailed evaluation from our CDP research, you're welcome to download that from our site at any time. It does look as though a few questions have come in, so Tony, I'll let you address those.
Yeah, so the first one is an interesting one from Francesco. Do you think CDP will replace DMPs completely as third-party cookies will disappear? It's a great question. I don't know whether they'll fully replace in enterprises that have a strong reliance on DMPs, depending on how they're using it. But I think that many of the things that historically you would have relied on a DMP in the future, you may be able to deal with in a CDP, including anonymous data records that then you can then carry forward their whole behavioral history as soon as they raise their hands and become a known profile within your enterprise. So I think going forward, particularly if it's a greenfield environment, you might want to think about whether you need both. But I think that there's a lot of potential for a CDP to take over many of the services. There's still somewhat different types of platforms, so you have to just keep that in mind. So I'm not sure whether entirely it will always be replacing DMPs in every use case. Francesco's also asking, what are the differences between data management and analytics? Yeah, we didn't get into that too much. Data management is really about the underlying data itself. And so some CDPs will provide very sophisticated forms of managing different logical data sets, being able to manage some data virtually as opposed to copying it over, having really complex ways of doing identity resolution, including predictive as opposed to declarative, and other kinds of really sophisticated ETL and data processing capabilities upstream and downstream. And you may or may not need that. I think in a larger enterprise, ideally you already have those services, and ideally they're already happening somewhere else. But in some cases, the marketing team can't get access to them, and so maybe you want that in a CDP. Analytics, on the other hand, is really about taking the data and generating reports and metrics, and in some cases maybe even doing predictive modeling, the sorts of things that you might otherwise do in a data lake or a data warehouse with maybe a BI and a visualization tool. You can do in a lightweight way in a CDP. Again, depends on your enterprise. In a more purist way, you wouldn't and shouldn't need that in a CDP, but we don't live in a pure world. And so some CDP vendors have really focused on that with respect to marketing analytics. James is asking a really interesting question, which is how important are client references and client retention rate when evaluating a CDP vendor? So I'll give you just first a generic answer, James, that around the 20 years that we've been doing this, both of those are always important. Certainly references that you want to talk to. If it's a big deal, I'd maybe even do some sort of site visit. Client retention rate is obviously an important metric in the software as a service world. Historically, it's been maybe a little bit more meaningful to investors than to enterprise customers. I'm not saying that it's meaningless. It can go up and it can go down. The CDP space is relatively young. We know that many of the initial implementations petered out, not because of the vendor per se, but because the customer simply wasn't ready. And so this is an environment where oftentimes there's some really poor fit customers because the customer and the vendor turned out to not be a good match. Other cases where you'll have vendors that focus just on one segment, like insurance or retail, and so their customers tend to be pretty happy, but it's a small set of customers, and so their retention rate might be very, very high. But if you're not a retailer, maybe it's not a good fit for you. So definitely look at client retention rate, but again, that can be more around the sales strategy and other sorts of things, and overall fit rather than some vendor failing in this space. Great, so that takes us to the bottom of the half hour. Wanted to thank all of you for taking a half hour out of what I expect is unusually busy and maybe disorienting time for you. And my wish for you is to be able to see your way clear to helping your employers make good decisions around this sort of stuff. I do believe that customer data is foundational, and so the work that you're doing is extremely important. And if there's any way that RSG can be helpful for you and your teams, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll continue the conversation. In the meantime, for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne signing off until next time. Thanks again. Bye now.